Hello and welcome to episode 78 of Comics Corner. I am your host, Jason, the curator of comics, and today's episode is going to feature a very interesting little-known French comics anthology called Metal Hurlant, and and in particular, we're going to be talking about the sci-fi television adaptation that ran for 12 episodes across 2 seasons in 2012 to 2014. Now, a little bit of backstory here on Metal Hurlant. It was created in 1974 by comics artists Jean Girard and Philippe Duret. With another writer, Jean-Pierre Donnet, who actually came back to kind of work on, or at the very least, they used his material for the actual television show. And surprisingly, there's a couple things to note. Number one, Metal Hurlant translates to screaming metal in French. Also, it's worth mentioning that in the United States, the title was published by National Lampoon under the title Heavy Metal, which is kind of interesting to say the least. Now, the series ran in its first volume until July of 1987, so yeah, 13 years almost, give or take, the first volume ran, before eventually getting a second volume renewed in July of 2002, which lasted only 14 issues in 2 years, which is a little more disappointing, to say the least. Now, there are a couple of interesting stories that were, in fact, published under Metal Hurlant. Some of them you may have heard of, some you may not have, such as Milady 3000, The Zombies That Ate the World by Guy Davis and Jerry Friesen, The Long Tomorrow, and 1996, among others. It is kind of funny to consider how some of them, including Fragile, were nearly adapted into actual film, but it really wasn't until 2014 when the show Metal Hurlant Chronicles aired on Sci-Fi, which is kind of interesting considering that it was a French-based comic that did get a localization, but at the same time, it wasn't exactly a well-known enough show that you think that Sci-Fi would have picked it up. However, they did, and despite the fact that it appeared nearly 2 years earlier on French television, it finally made its way over to the United States. And much like its comic book counterpart, this is mostly an anthology series, for better or worse. But I will say that the casting for a lot of these episodes was really, really impressive. I mean, in the back of the DVD box that I own, produced by Shout Factor, by the way, who do great DVD work, there is a list of who's who for a lot of sci-fi actors who play parts in Metal Hurlant Chronicles, like Rutger Hauer from Blade Runner, Michael Biehn of Aliens, John Rhys Davies, always awesome, James Marsters from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Michael Jai White from Spawn, Scott Adkins from Expendables 2, Kelly Brook from Piranha 3D, Joe Flanagan from Stargate Atlantis, Michelle Ryan from Doctor Who, and Dominique Pignon from Alien Resurrection. Those are just some of the major names and probably the most noteworthy ones that actually make an appearance in the overall series. Now, admittedly, again, much like its comic counterpart, these are anthology stories, and in many ways, it's worth noting that Metal Hurlant is a hybrid of horror and sci-fi. The best way I can think to describe a lot of Metal Hurlant's stories, if this TV show is anything to go by, is that it's kind of Twilight Zone-y meets the various writings of another famous sci-fi writer named Harlan Ellison, who I really like, by the way. Ellison also is very famous for compilation stories like these, and while I wouldn't say that Ellison's work is exactly like Metal Hurlant Chronicles, a lot of these stuff is very similar. More short stories and very less on, not so much comic books in their own right. Now, despite the fact that, it's worth noting that there are 2 seasons of 12 episodes and they each aired in 6 episodes apiece. Now, I feel that I should note that most of the stories are actually kind of interesting. Some of them, not so much. I think part of the biggest problem with the show is, despite the fact that they have a lot of stars, a lot of the time they try to cram in basically a lot of plot into one singular episode that lasts around 20 minutes each. And the real problem is that because Metal Hurlant is relatively unfocused, like, as you expect for an anthology story, kind of like The Twilight Zone, there's no real one specific character that you're following. You're just following a random scenario from episode to episode. And that's kind of what really turns me off from the whole thing almost as a whole. The acting and the special effects are great, but a lot of the other stuff is just but it's unfocused in terms of, going from plot to plot, which can be very, very annoying if you're somebody who follows. There are a couple of interesting notes. For starters, each episode actually starts with an information dump basically explaining what Metal Hurlant is. It is apparently a fragment from a dying world that basically led to destruction by the madness of its inhabitants, and is basically condemned to travel through space and time, basically creating sadness and despair along the way. So yeah, basically the asteroid is seen in every single episode, basically causing chaos and misfortune. So yeah, it's one of those plot devices, and really that's the only real reason for the whole series to even be called Metal Hurlant. It's not like it has any other connection other than the stories that it shares, but it's kind of interesting. I will say that the stories of the series are, again, very hit or miss, especially if you're not the type of person who enjoys, the type of stories where, there's pretty much no guarantee of anything good out in terms of an outcome positive for any of the characters. The first episode's King's Crown basically kind of exemplifies this, of a good person basically by the end just getting completely screwed over, and basically, kind of setting the whole tone for the entire series. My favorite episode probably of the first season has to be Shelter Me, mostly because it's a great tale of isolation, and it's probably one of the few episodes that makes the whole isolated and disjointed plot that, the whole series has actually work. It also helps that it's kind of very eerily similar to a direction that, society could head if, say, like a nuclear fallout occurred, with two people being randomly trapped in a bunker and nowhere to go. The third episode of the show is actually written by one of my favorite comic authors, Jeff Johns, which is actually really cool. In fact, there are a lot of American comic writers that do in fact actually have experience writing on Metal Hurlant, or at the very least they've crafted some of the stories for it. The problem is that it's like I said, I'd probably much rather read the stories than watch them actually be, produced in real time. The real problem isn't even that, like I said, that they end on downer points. The real problem is that they just kind of sort of are there. Like, again, no connecting theme means that you're not invested in any way, shape, or form as to what's going on. And like I said earlier, the great acting kind of ends up losing a lot of its impact when you know that after this episode, there's not really going to be a whole lot of interesting, or not necessarily interesting rather, but, connected story overall. And that's really kind of where it kind of sucks. Again, another great episode in season 2, and ironically is in fact the one with John Rhys Davies, who I could probably read from the phone book, is Loyal Condor. And again, it's another great story that ironically also probably connects more so than other stories in the actual book. In fact, there's actually a bit of follow-up between that episode and the next, if for no other reason than it's because of that it feels like the series finally gets a little bit more connectivity and actually, feels like it belongs a little bit more together in a television show. But that feeling is kind of squandered between episodes 3 and 4 of the second season, and the rest of them are decent enough stories, again, acted very well, but they don't necessarily offer a whole lot of intrigue, to keep you pulled in, because you know that these are going to be the kind of one and done stories. And the other problem is that while the acting is passable, and like I said, for the most part, decent enough, is that it's the writing is what really lets the acting down. In fact, I think that's probably the big thing. I'd say the series is acted decently enough, like I mentioned earlier, but it's just so unpoorly balanced in the writing and production department outside of the visual effects that you really don't feel like you can get invested. And I think that's really the big problem is that there's really no reason to get invested because it's an anthology series that has, by the most part, no connection to one another, and because it's an anthology series. And the other problem is like I said, despite the fact that Guillaume Lubrano wrote most of the series. In fact, he wrote all 12 of the episodes, sans 1 or 2 here and there. It's not really a consistent vision overall. And I think a lot of that has to do with taking from stories that themselves just feel like they're disconnected. Probably if you read them, on their own. Most good stories actually probably in terms of comics are able to hold your attention on their own without you having to read multiple stories for backstory or even in the beginning, usually in a text block or two. Unfortunately, with an anthology series, you're never really given the chance to grow and care about these characters, especially when in both comics and in television, in anthology series, oftentimes characters are discarded and storylines are often ignored for the sake of a TV show. It's why very few shows like The Twilight Zone have actually ever existed. It's because it's very hard to make an anthology series compelling when you know that the very next episode is going to have nothing, if very little, connecting it to the previous episode. And that's really kind of disappointing, all things considered, when, there's actual effort put into making the series look decent. Like I said, the cinematography and the visual effects for this is really, really good. It's just a shame that not a whole lot else really stands out for it otherwise. Anyways, I guess if what I'm trying to say, to summarize, is Metal Hurlant Chronicles is an okay at times series, but really nothing worth picking up. In fact, I dare say it's actually really worth ignoring, and it's kind of crappy in most other aspects. It's a shame that the amazing amount of star power really doesn't contribute to a much better product, which is a shame because, like I said, a lot of these actors do turn in good performances. And I can only really handpick a couple of episodes that actually really, really do very well, in my opinion. Like I said, the second episode of the series, Shelter Me, is probably the best of the bunch. And that's probably because of the isolated nature and just how real it actually feels in both terms of reality and sci-fi mixing together, and how you could arguably throw in some horror elements on top of that and it would be all the more intriguing. But in the end, that's really all I have to say about Metal Hurlant Chronicles, and yeah, it's not really a whole lot now, is it? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this video. It is a little bit more brief than I would ordinarily like, but I feel like I owed it to you after another delay, which I honestly really hate that it happened. But until then, I will see you guys in the next edition of Comics Corner. Signing off.